Hello again and welcome to the chapter about revolution. This is a really intriguing topic. Its name derives from the great book by Grandmaster Josef Dorfman called The Method. And what Dorfman discusses in this book, he discusses many things, but one of the key topics is how we can somehow define who is better in this or that position and what does this mean for the play for the ideas of both sides. So basically he's referring to the static balance. He outlines a number of factors that we should take into account, like the pawn structure, king safety, and things like that. And based on that, we can establish who is favored right now by the static balance. And if it's white, for example, in that case, this side should carry out what he calls evolution, like slowly improving the pieces, trying to find better squares for the knight, or maybe pushing the pawn majority, things like that, like natural things which doesn't really change the nature of the battle. While the opponent, who is not favored by the static balance, who is worse, you would say, long term, must do exactly the opposite. They have to look for some kind of drastic way of changing the balance of the position, some pawn break in the middle, going for an attack, maybe betting on a passed pawn, because actually the passed pawn and also an attack at the opponent's king, these are two directions of play, you could say, which will like overrule any inferiority, like a worse pawn structure, doubled pawns, things like that. So it's a very interesting topic about revolution and evolution. Again, the side who is supposedly better should try to do the evolution, like slowly improving their pieces, maneuvering and so on, while the side which is having difficulties long term, they should rather look for revolution. So that's what this chapter is about. When we feel that we are worse statically or long term, how can we somehow try to turn the tables? Where is that revolution that could help us in this sense? So revolution, how should we interpret that term? In my way of thinking, it's something closely connected to dynamics, because dynamics is, in my way of seeing things, is what really changes the position long term. And in this sense, I'm thinking about pawn play, like pawn breaks, creating a passed pawn maybe, something like opening up space for our pieces and changing the nature of the battle in a rather drastic way. There is some kind of conflict here. You could say that also pawn play is part of evolution, like I was saying, no, advancing the pawns, the pawn majority, which could eventually lead to the creation of a passed pawn. So maybe this is slightly contradictory. Pawn play could probably, you could classify it in both cases, right? In both these categories with evolution and revolution. But as I see it, it's slightly more connected to revolution. So pawn play in the first place, but then also we have these two directions of trying to go for an attack at the opponent's king. This would overrule any other situation on the board, and also the passed pawn, because if you queen a passed pawn, material changes completely. So that's another valid direction, you could say, in this sense. Also, you should notice that often when you carry out the revolution, you are perhaps including some kind of sacrifice. You can sacrifice material, like a pawn, for example, or the exchange, but you can also sacrifice your structure a little, like the pawn structure. We actually saw this in the previous chapter. If you remember, we had this game with the black pieces, Sivuk versus white, Christensen, where Sivuk used his f6 pawn break in order to open up the position for his pieces. And he ended up with a slight weakness on e6, like statically speaking, a weakness. But it was worth the price, you could say, to turn the tables a little and open up the game for the pieces. So there can be some kind of concession involved. We have the situation with some material, that's very common, a pawn, for example, but also we have this structural thing that we can accept the weakness. I still remember that Dorfman himself, he had a very nice game against Paunovic, I think, where Dorfman accepted doubling all his pawns in order to set up a passed pawn on the queen side. I think I even included this one in Mastering Chess Strategy. So yeah, very entertaining work by Josef Dorfman. I can definitely recommend it for anyone interested in positional chess. Anyway, let's get going with our chapter about revolution. We will start with a few situations taking place in the center. Then I would like to show you something involving the flanks. I think some revolution taking place on one of the flanks. We have something about the sacrifices involved in the revolution, and also I think I have one example featuring this positional concession that we end up with weaknesses or so on in order to carry out the the revolution. All right, time to get going. Let's take our first example here. It's a game between with white pieces Panchulaya and playing black is Gupta. You can see very quickly that it's some kind of reversed Benoni. We can see that from the white pawn chain, right? Something like that. Black has pushed d4 like if they were white in the Benoni and they have a pawn on e5. So I would say that statically this pawn structure is better for black, as I see it. If you remove the pieces, for example, all the pieces, you would say that black has a space advantage and they have a natural plan which consists in playing e4. This would be their key idea in this structure. What black would like to do is that, push e4, opening up more space, typical plan in the Benoni, with white also push e5. What black would like to play, perhaps if they had a time to evolve, you would say, to go for evolution, they would play something like queen d6 to protect his pawn, then they would go maybe e4, maybe they could prepare it with rook a e8 also. That would be their way of evolving. Once you play e4, perhaps the knight could settle on e5 and things like that. However, it was white to play, and they correctly decided that it was time to make revolution. So what do you think white played? How can they somehow drastically change the nature of the battle here, change the pawn structure, get the game into a completely different pawn structure? Of course, you got it. It's a typical plan in the Benoni with the black pieces, and of course, we can also carry it out here with white in the reversed form. So Panchulaya hurried to play here the move e3. In this way, we soften up black's pawn structure. We are now starting to take on d4, eliminating their grip on the center, so to speak. So black had to play here pawn takes e3, which they didn't like to play. Queen d6, just for the record, actually drops a pawn here. As you can see, e takes, and we could target that pawn. You got it, knight b3. Don't forget, we talked about this in the previous chapter, in the last example. Tactics are also involved in the strategical battle, right? We also have to think a little about tactical tricks and so on. Here you can see that, for example, we are benefiting from the pin along the a3 f8 diagonal so that black cannot take this pawn. It's us, it's we who will take that pawn on d4 next turn. So this would be very nice for white. So in the game, after the move, strong move e3, Gupta played d takes e3, and after f takes e3, you can see that already white is about to take their next step in their revolution, because still you would say this pawn structure is probably better for black. It's more healthy, they have more space, and we have these two weaknesses, no? Statically speaking. So what black played here, they didn't want to play e4 because there is knight h4, as you can see, targeting black's king side. Don't forget about king safety, right? That's always also involved. I think that was very high on Dorfman's list in any case about factors which would determine who had the strategical balance or the static balance in favor and so on. Anyway, f takes e3, so black played here rook a8, getting all the pieces into the battle, and white continued with their, what would you say, revolutionary business. They played here the move d4. Very nice, simple and strong. Actually, in the French, you might say, but this has nothing to do with the French. But if you think about the pawns on the opposite color, in the French you have this situation also, right? You play f3 with white, and after e takes f3, you take bishop takes f3, and you go e4. I think we even had this in the chapter about pawn breaks, defensive pawn breaks. The first example, Volkov's example, I think we touched upon this topic, including a sacrifice, rook takes f6. That was a little about, I would say, revolution. But also in the French, I mean, with the black pieces, I'm talking about f6, like in some Tarrasch French, perhaps with knight f6 on move 3. Later on there's f6, they take on f6, black takes back on f6, and black pushes e5. Yeah, many French games like that. No French player, I mean, each French player has done that at least once, I think, in their life. So it's basically the same idea, just that here it takes place one step to the left on the board, so to speak. Anyway, let's see what happened here. They took on d4, e takes d4, e takes d4. Already now I would say white's pawn structure is nicer than black's. There is not, I mean, the static balance, it's not against white anymore. It's probably favoring white, but the game is still interesting. They played here knight e4, and Panchulaya hurried to attack here, actually, interestingly. You could expect something like rook a1 to develop the pieces, but he knew that black's king was slightly weak due to this move h6. This pawn is a little shaky on g6, so he noticed that and played knight takes e4, because if black takes with a rook, which perhaps they would like to play, well, as you can see, this move is very powerful. Knight e5, you can see that there is something going on g6, and if that pawn falls, yeah, you can also, don't forget please, that white's queen is also getting close, right? So this is dangerous. Yeah, white will probably win the exchange here thanks to several threats coming up here in this position. So after knight takes e4, black took back with the pawn instead, but now they have a lonely pawn on e4, which white hurried to attack. You could have played maybe knight h4, but even stronger knight d2 was played here by Pantsulaia, targeting the pawn on e4. You can see that after e3, white is ready to play knight e4, and then they can just pick up the pawn. It's not going away. If you play something like e2, you can go rook e1. Well, I was saying that, but I checked my notes at the same time, and we were actually supposed to take first on f8. Yeah, I think I understand why, because if they take with the rook, we can then take the pawn. I think several times we came across the situation, right, with the rook tension. That's always tricky to figure out who is favored by trading at which point and so on. But here it's favoring white. Yeah, if I play it my way, I think there is some difference. Now black keeps a rook on the e file or something like that. Or they can take with the rook maybe. But here on the other hand, they have to take with a knight to keep the pawn, and then we go knight e4. And you can see tactically, yeah, we have some extra benefits from this. So yeah, that would be the case in this case. After knight e2, if black goes e3, we take on f8 and we play knight e4 with multiple threats. c5 was played in the game, trying to open up the game and especially protect the pawn, but Pantsulaia simply reacted with d5. After knight f6, rook a e1, white is already targeting this pawn. I should tell you that in the game they played in a different way. They made it a little more complex for them, I would say. They played knight b3. Now, indeed, white is winning material. You can see that there is no way black can protect both pawns here. But Gupta did the correct thing. He went for complications. When we're in trouble, try to complicate the game. We talked about that. We saw also in the previous chapter, if you remember the example, Mammadzada white and Ivic black, we saw that Ivic shouldn't trade queens when he was worse. He should try to keep the queens on and try to create counterplay. That's what happened here. Black played e3, and after queen takes e5, of course, no way we will trade queens here. Queen e5, very good move. Rook a e1 and a4. I think the computer was still preferring clearly white here, but white's task is not that simple on the board, I would say. And in the end, this game was actually drawn. So it shows that, yeah, white had some problems to solve here, and a computer would solve them, of course. But you and me sitting there sweating at the board, it wouldn't be that simple. So good play here by Gupta, good practical play. After knight f6, white could have tried instead rook a e1, keeping things under control. Here it's more difficult to see how black can really keep the balance. I looked at queen e5 in similar fashion to Gupta's played in the game, but here you can see after queen takes c5, e3, we can now go with the knight to the other side where it will help in the kingside defense. So knight f3 seems very clever, and after queen c3, what would you play with the white pieces? Yeah, we're not talking about revolution anymore, quite the opposite. Exactly. If black is favored by the presence of queens, that means that we should go for that ourselves with white here in this case. So knight d4, queen d4, that would be a good move here, trying to trade off the queens. And if they don't want to trade, well, they have to move away with the queen, and we are favored, let's say queen a3. We are favored by having the queen in the center. Speaking of the center, exactly, we would love to put the knight in the center. I think we can do that, knight e5, and you can see black has big troubles here in this position. The pawn down, their bishop is not playing, and yeah, white has a firm grip on the position, you could say. So basically what we have seen here in this example is that, statically speaking, black's pawn structure was better, but white hurried to make a revolution, so to speak, e3, and later on after pawn takes, they were ready to play d4 as well. This was very important, this move d4. So they basically managed to improve the pawn structure, and they even got some advantage later on in this game. So very important first notion about dynamics or revolution, use our pawns in order to improve the pawn structure, so to speak. All right, next example, it's also another reversed opening, you could say. In this game between with white pieces Akopyan and playing black is Kogen, you can see here that white is playing some kind of Old Indian with reversed colors. If you remember the Old Indian, when you play with black, like knight f6, d6, knight bd7, e5, bishop e7, something like that. That's what Akopyan is playing here with the white pieces. Interesting choice. Maybe you can move away your opponent from opening preparation by playing something like that, but objectively, it shouldn't be that good, perhaps. In any case, what we're interested here is the dynamic part of the game, so to speak, the middle game, the strategical battle. And what has happened here is black played at this moment, they just played the move a5. Typical move, by the way, with reverse colors and this kind of structure to create weaknesses. But this was probably not the right moment to do it, and we will see why. Akopyan noticed correctly that at this moment he can start, you could say, revolutionary actions. He can actually completely change the pawn structure. Here you could see that black has more space, white is like a little passive, a little restricted. Both bishops are kind of passive here. Yeah, this bishop is just terrible right now, I would say, without any offense intended, no, but it's not a very powerful bishop. But just wait and you will see what it will do later in this game. So what everything revolves around here, I would say, here is the square on d4. If black can keep a grip on that square, they will always be better thanks to their space advantage. The static balance would favor them, so to speak. White should try to fight against that square with all their means. You can find the same situation in other openings, like for example the Sicilian Sveshnikov, where the d5 square is of key importance and black tries to undermine that square in many ways, or ultimately play around it in some way. But here, what white did, what Akopyan did, he actually started, let's say, hostile actions against that pawn. So how did he do that? Well, he started with b takes c5. Move order is important here. If you start with cd, black will take back like that as well, cd, and they have basically killed white's dynamics. You can see now this bishop is terrible, the other bishop is not great either. Black's bishops are great. You can see that, for example, pawn takes, queen takes, I think knight b3, we just go back. Complete nightmare for white to play this position, bishop b6. In the King's Indian, at least, you have a pawn on g3 and you try to get in f4 at some point, but here you even don't have that. So this would be a complete nightmare for white. It would be the typical case where black goes for evolution, trying to improve their pieces. Maybe the pawn could go here, the bishop goes there, so that there is no knight g5. Then we can maybe play rook a8, we can target this pawn, maybe we can bring over the knight and things like that. Many things can happen here slowly. Black would improve their position. So this didn't happen because Akopyan, he took on c5 instead. So now the pawn structure will always be like fluid, you could say. Now many different structure can appear here. Black played in the game bishop takes c5. If they take first on c3, yeah, after we take back and they play bishop takes c5, there was an important detail here. Tactics is always present, you would say, in this situation with revolution. White could play here. I mean, there is knight b3, but we're hanging the pawn on a3. So d4 can actually be played here. Interestingly, this is a very good move because after pawn takes, we can go bishop a1, and you can see at least 3 ideas for white here. 1, pick up the pawn like that. 2, attack this pawn on b5. And 3, maybe the most important one, do something on the c file. These two pieces are exposed, right? Something like queen c2 and rook c1, and we could even perhaps win material here. So this is a difficult position for black. I forgot to say also we have 4 e5 is also coming up. So basically all white's pieces are waking up here. It's difficult for black to keep track of everything. I don't know, bishop a3, maybe bishop takes b5 first. We put some pressure there. I don't know if there's some cheap tactic with queen a4, perhaps hitting a little here, hitting a little there, and things like that. So white definitely wakes up here in the game after the strong move. D takes e5, black simply took back instead, bishop takes e5. And here, Akopyan again needs to be very careful. If he plays knight b3, then the move order is not correct because now black can take on c3, and this is a different situation. Now, if bishop c3, it's like we already used up that move, knight b3. We didn't keep maximum flexibility like in the previous line. So that wouldn't be that powerful. Bishop takes, black takes on a3. We can't, for example, attack the pawn anymore. On the other hand, white could take on c5, but then black takes back. This was not ideal. Rook takes, and you can see knight e4, black is keeping track of this square. They keep it under control. That's what everything revolves around here, the d4 square. So in the game, white instead took like that, c takes d4, which means that they keep knight b3 in the pocket. Black played at this point knight takes d4. I think if they take with the pawn, they have problems on the c file, right? Yeah, we can play that queen c2. We talked about this already. And on the other hand, if you take here with the bishop, yeah, there was another interesting idea here. You can take with the knight, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, and here we have a nice move. Question, how do you think white can fight against black's central grip? That's right. Maybe we can take on d4 and then play knight f3, but even stronger, knight f3 immediately. We put some additional pressure. If we can take with a knight, this means that we will have a long-term target also on d4. And if black plays something like knight takes, queen takes, you can see that white is actually about to play this on the very next move, d4, and play e5, and white has all the play, and so on. So yeah, interesting how white can somehow accept the worst pawn structure. If you just look at the pawns, you would say, oh, terrible. Backward pawn on d3, weak square on d4. But if you look a little closer into the dynamics, you can see that it's actually white who's better here. Computers, by the way, they understand this very well. Dynamics, definitely, you can learn a lot from them, checking their variations and so on. They see all the, what can I say, optical illusions. They see through them, obviously. When I feel that I'm worse, they show some nice dynamic idea and so on. Anyway, let's see the game. They played in the game knight takes d4. Now white should trade quickly on d4 so that black's queen ends up there, where it will be exposed to the move knight f3 or the knight b3. So that explains the next moves here. Knight takes. If I wanted to show you variation here, if bishop takes, yeah, that's the game. But if they take with a pawn, there is a very nice variation, which I think was the computer who showed it now. It says rook c1, bishop b6, and rook c6. But you would say, hey, what's the rook doing there? What if black just attacks it? Bishop e7. And here comes the computer's brilliant idea. Aha, exchange sacrifice. Very nice. Rook takes, queen takes. You could play knight f3, but even more, you could say, incisive queen a1. Very nice. You see, it's now coming. Now the bishop will take, and it will have complete command of the long diagonal. Rook bd8, I guess, and knight f3. We can take back next move, or with the knight perhaps. We are still slightly material down, but we have a fantastic position. So nice battery on the long diagonal. So that's what could happen if black takes with the pawn on d4. In the game they took with the bishop to keep the control. Black really tries, Kogan tries to keep track of this, to keep control of the outpost the whole time here. Bishop takes, queen takes. How would they have loved to trade places here, these two pieces, if they could have the knight on d4 instead, but that's not the case here. So white played here knight f3. It was possible to go the other way also, but Akopyan, a very experienced grandmaster, he knows that putting the knight here is very useful for targeting this pawn. Please also notice that he's happy that h3 was played, else black, like in the Sicilian Sveshnikov, they could try to trade off the knight. That's a very strong knight, so black would be happy to trade it off, but here they can't do that. Yeah, you see what I mean. In the Sveshnikov, you play bishop g5 quickly, now you take on f6 in many variations in the opening. Anyway, queen c5 was played here, and I have a question for you. Is it time now to maybe push d4, just like Pantzulaia did in the previous game? Or is there something else to be done here, left to be done? In a way, both answers are correct now. If you like, you can play d4, and you have already successfully executed your revolutionary plan, you could say. You have managed to change the pawn structure. Now the pieces are waking up and so on. Pawn takes, you could go e5, and you have a lot of counterplay and so on. Still, after knight e5, black is fighting back. There is something on c3 and so on. Some chances left for black here still. So what Akopyan did, even if this was interesting, he said, all right, I will keep that in the pocket. I'll add some little extra pressure to black's camp. So he played here the move queen c1. Very clever, because if now black takes, you can see that white will take like that, and we have rook c5 coming up. Please notice again, I'm boring you with this, but please notice the pawn structure as such is better for black. If you move away all the pieces from the board, black is probably winning, I guess. They will bring up the king and they win. They have an outside passed pawn and so on. But with the pieces on the board, it's a different story. And we have this strong threat of rook c5. Dynamics favor white here, you could say. So after queen c1, black played queen a7, white played queen c3, targeting the pawn on e5. And only when black removes the knight from f6, targeting e4, then white will strike with d4. Yeah, that makes perfect sense, right? Only after knight e7, now we play d4, because now they don't have pressure at our center anymore. So after pawn takes, knight takes, this is how the game went. And yeah, white already has a much nicer position. You can see that there are tactics coming up. Knight here, something's hanging on b5, e5 maybe at some point also. White later on went on to win this game. So I thought it was a very nice example of how you can start from a position which is statically worse, you would say, but you can find a way to fight against their outpost, so to speak. Some kind of guerrilla strategy, you could say. You take on c5, and then you play this move, c takes d4, and later on you play knight f3 or knight b3, something like that. I thought that was an interesting example, which can be very useful also if you're sitting on the opposite side, if you're sitting with King's Indian or perhaps old Indian position. So t takes d4, knight takes d4, and here what Akopyan did correctly, he traded twice and he put his knight on f3, and then he had more pressure, and he went on to to put more pressure by queen c1 and queen c3, and ultimately only at the very last moment he played the move d4. So yeah, very nice example, I think, something to remember. We can maybe, should we keep it like this, maybe d takes e4 and knight takes d4. Yeah, I think something like that. I think now we understand this perfectly. All right, let's continue. Let's take an example with a slightly similar situation. Again, something is going on in the center. You can see that in this game between Niemann with white and I wonder Liang with the black pieces, you can see that white somehow, they have I don't know if I should say better pawn structure, but there is something in favor of white's pawn structure. If they can keep this square under control, well, they have an outpost there, and also they are having some pressure at this pawn on e5 in the long run. But I think what mostly stands out in this position is the white bishop. It's a very strong bishop. They would like to play something like knight h4, maybe put the bishop on d5, queen on h5, and play a little for an attack. But there is a way in which black can change the logic of this position. They can change the nature of the battle, and again, pawn play is involved. You would say e4, of course, that's very evident. Of course, I should play e4 and break the pawn chain and so on. But there are some tactics here, and what Niemann played here was knight h4, very clever. You can see now that if we take on d3, yeah, then they will take on e7, knight takes, and there is rook e1. As you can see, tactic coming up here. They're hitting the knight on e7, and also there is a dependency. The bishop is hanging, so that's not advisable for black. They need to do something with the bishop, and in the game, Liang played simply bishop h7. But here, after d takes e4, queen e6, this is how the game went. You can see that actually black carried out some kind of revolution. They are statically better here, probably. But white has counterplay, so white play here queen h5. That was Niemann's move, and knight f5 is coming very soon. They have definite counterplay. What I think about this position is that we should always be a little respectful about that bishop. As soon as that bishop wakes up, so line with e5 and bishop d5, things like that, that bishop is going to be really great. Yeah, not right now, of course. Right now the rook is hanging, but maybe on some later occasion. There was another way to carry out this idea. We have to switch the move order a little. There are some tactics involved here. Aha, I think you found it. Yeah, exactly. We can do it by means of a temporary sacrifice. You got it completely right. Bishop takes d3 first, and after queen takes e4, it's a different story. What's going on here is that if white plays queen e2, we will take on f3. And the nice thing about this is that we will probably manage to push d3 later on here. Let's see. Yeah, I cannot take here because we just take back and we win a pawn. So you have to take like that. Bishop takes, we take, and here I think the key move is this one. Yeah, tactics present. Now you can see bishop takes, there is rook d8, skewering the two bishops. So black would be much better here. You can see the bishop is coming and the rook and so on. Yeah, total nightmare for white. But I think that Liang, he saw this in the game. That was the reason why he didn't play like this. And I think I know what's the reason. After queen f1, now if black takes back, pawn takes f3, white would take back on f3. This looks great for black, right? The pin along the f file. Unfortunately, when we go knight e5, of course they will play bishop d5. So I think as long as that bishop stays on the board, white will always have chances. It's true that black managed to improve the pawn structure. Now they have a passed pawn and so on. But white's also active in this game. Later they can try to, I don't know, put the queen on g2, maybe put the rook on e1. They're fighting back in this position. So this is not the maximum white can get, but maybe this is where Liang ended his analysis in the game. But there was something stronger here. So if we don't take back on f3 right now, do you think again we can somehow improve the move order? Exactly. That makes a big difference when we wait a little with the capture on f3. You got it. We can play here the move knight e5. Now it's a different story because we're ready to take also with a knight on f3, right? And yeah, they had a problem in the first place to actually keep the material balance. So here, for example, white will have to play bishop f4. We can now take, and in that way we manage to get rid of that annoying bishop. We can take on f3 for that reason with the knight, more forcing. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes. And I think in this position, without that light squared bishop on the board, white's position is not that great anymore. I didn't mention this, but this is also something to notice. No, black is very happy, just like in the Benoni in general. We like to fix the pawns like that. This pawn is weak forever. So what they played here, black, in the game, in this variation, sorry, queen e6, makes perfect sense. And it's not easy for white to keep the balance here. We would like to take the pawn if they protect it. Yeah, if they play queen d5, by the way, this is very dangerous because we get these two pawns now, very, very powerful. So probably after queen e6, they should go rook c1, and now we should probably defend this pawn by rook f7. And I think black is better in this position. It's not so easy for white to do something here. So one plan I think I outlined here was to put the queen on f5, and maybe we can go h5, h4. As I see it, white is very passive. They will have a long day at the office here in this position. Black is having the right pieces, or white is having the wrong pieces perhaps. White would love to have a knight on d3 or a bishop on g2, but they don't. So all the time this will be like hanging over them. And even king safety is slightly slightly a problem here. If black could trade off the bishops also, I think black is much better in this pawn structure. So yeah, that's what could have happened in the game if black had proceeded in this way with bishop takes d3 and later on e4, trying to get to a better pawn structure here with knight e5 next. But okay, not easy to see through all these details at the board. Let's see something which takes place on the queen side. We talked about the situation with the passed pawn, that the passed pawn was a very, very, how can I say, decisive factor in the strategical battle. And here we have one example in this game between Haba with the white pieces and Shengelia playing black. You can see that white sacrificed the exchange, or well, but they got a pawn and they have a very nice pressure on this position. You can see that all their pieces are active. The pawn on e6 is a big weakness. In fact, white is about to take that pawn right now. In the game, black tried to fight back by means of e5, but this basically meant that all white's pieces, they woke up here. After d takes e5, f takes e5, knight e5, you can see concrete threat on this side. There is something going on there also. Bishop g7, white didn't care to take here. Maybe there is some counterplay with rook b8 possibly. So they played here bishop takes e5. Very nice calculation. What white has noticed is that again, that is this hanging over black, the fork on f6. So after queen f5, if you take a few times on e5, in the end you can see that that will be knight f6 check. Yeah, for example, if you take like this and I take, yeah, if you take like this, I can play this straight away, right? I win the queen, so that doesn't really work. So if you take with the bishop instead, yeah, it's a different tactical situation. Yeah, exactly. Now we can just play this straight away also. So yeah, black is doing badly in all the variations after bishop takes e5. So they had a difficult time here. They played queen f5, but after bishop takes d7, rook takes e4, bishop d4, funny material situation here, but you can see that white has many threats and so on. It's difficult for black to defend here. Rook e6, there was another fork coming up on c7, knight c7, rook a e8, black has to give back material, knight takes, rook takes, and simply queen takes b6. By now you can see that material even favors white. The extra exchange for black is not really that useful, you could say. White later on went on to win. So this was difficult for black. They went for some kind of active defense, but it backfired. It just invited white's pieces to the attack. Knight d8, that would be like the, what can I say, the passive defense. Speaking of endgame situations, however, white could actually, they could increase their grip on the king side here. Aha, g4, very clever move. This is another facet of pawn play, trying to soften up weaknesses in the opponent's camp. Also, it's nice, of course, to have some extra space for the king. After bishop d6, we can simply continue here with g5, and if play f5, we can just move away the rook somewhere, rook e3. This will be very pleasant for white. You can see one idea might be to reroute the knight to e5, another idea perhaps push the pawns on that side. And you can see it's not a rook-friendly position. It's very nice for the minor pieces because it's rather closed. And exactly that is the last thing that we should notice here from this position. We need to open up the game somehow. And if you think about it, you have all white's pieces on the king side basically, no, except for the queen. All the others, they are on this side. But what about the queen side then? What could be done on the queen side? Aha, if you think a little about like pawn endgame logic, that you want to set up a passed pawn or something like that, what would you play? Aha, definitely b5. So this was a very nice opportunity for black. You can see in the first place that if white takes with the queen, they actually end up in a very bad endgame here. Black would take, and they will play rook a b8. You can see now that we're going to take this pawn, and if they play c4, we can just play here knight e6. And yeah, this is not good for white at all. And they can have their pawn on e6. We don't care. We have something to play for on the queen side, as you can see. We're targeting this pawn if we can take it. Yeah, and the rest is, our plan is simple, no? Trying to push the passed pawn. So that's not completely convincing for white after b5. If they take with the pawn instead, they keep the queens on, but this gives black a chance to insert this important move, which is part of their plan, of course, to push the potential passed pawn, queen a2, and we can now take on b5. Yeah, exactly. They can't go to c4 because in that case, again, you got it. We have knight d6 coming up. So queen a2 and we take on b5. You can see now we're ready to play this. Or perhaps there is another move that we can play. Aha, we will come to that. Knight takes e6. Yeah, we shouldn't play this, of course, because there is a bishop on the board also. But something else can happen here. If you really want to help that passed pawn, what would you play? That's right. That's a nice move, no? Queen b3. You see, we're offering the trade of queens and also we're hitting the knight on e6. So after queen takes, pawn takes, you don't even need to calculate this. It's enough to understand that the rook will come to a2 and we're hitting the pawn on b2. Even ideas like bishop a3 might come up, who knows, on b2. So this would be very, very annoying for white, this position. So what I think would be the main line here after the move b5, it would be to play here immediately knight takes e6. I think this was the most critical choice. Pawn takes and queen a2. White tries to keep the queens on the board to keep on attacking. What we can do here, we can try to bring the queen to b3. There are two ways to get there. Which do you think would be the best route? Please don't go this way because they have knight c7. So for that reason, avoiding that, of course, we go to b7 instead, and we're also targeting the rook on e4. So they would play something like d5, trying to keep on their initiative, so to speak. We play our stuff here with queen b3. As you can see, that's what we would like to do. We want to help our potential passed pawn. They cannot take on a4 because we have the threat here also, right? So they would have to trade queens instead. They would have to accept the trade of queens here. Queen takes, pawn takes. And you can see that now black's game is easy to understand. We're about to push the pawn. They will have to block it somehow. Rook a4 perhaps. How can we possibly get at this pawn? Can you find some other way of attacking it now that the a file is blocked? We should look at the whole board, and we suddenly notice this very nice angle. Exactly, bishop h6 coming to c1. So let's say knight fd4 trying to take the pawn on b3. That's of course logical for white. We go bishop c1. Now the pawns are traded. Knight takes, bishop takes. But I don't think that black is any worse in this endgame. Materially is about so-so, but black is active. You can see that also we can trade off this knight at any moment, maybe with knight d8 or knight g5. There is something going on the first rank also. Definitely black is not without chances, and in fact we have a passed pawn still. Right now it won't move, but maybe a little later if we're able to, the bishop here try to bring over the rook somehow and challenge this rook on a4. So that's what could have happened here, but if you ask me, this is not a simple case. I tried it on several students. Very few of them would notice this plan with b5. It's not something very natural that comes to mind here, especially since we're giving away something. But it's the nature of the battle here. White is having control of the center and the king side. We should try to do something where their pieces aren't really present, and that's what we can do here. b5, very unexpected and very strong. Somehow we are able to start a new front here. We're able to bet for a passed pawn, or a potential passed pawn, you could say, which would change the static balance here completely. All right, let's have a look at, actually we're talking about sacrifices, right? I was going to say let's have a look at how we can use sacrifices in this sense, but we actually saw one example already. Let's have a look at another example, how we are sacrificing a pawn in order to turn the pawn structure into our favor. And in this next example, we have another Sicilian Alapin with the white pieces Abdelauf and playing black is Smirin. So what we can see here quickly is that the pawn structure is a clear case of a static balance favoring one of the players. Black is very happy about this pawn structure. It comes up frequently, by the way, in the Alapin. We actually had an example like that. In which chapter was that? About defensive exchanges, if you remember, we had an example like this. Something with black playing bishop. If you remember, they played something like bishop takes f3. Sorry, like that. They played knight a5, they took that, and they played bishop g5. I don't really remember the names of the players right now, but we had that in one example. But here, of course, you can see that this is not going to happen because there is tension on the d file. So they will be in danger of some move like bishop takes a7 if they take on f3 too soon. So in any case, it's white to play here. What I wanted to single out here is that the structure clearly favors black here because of these weaknesses, no? And also black has a nice stronghold on c4 where they can put a knight or a bishop at some point. I mean, one plan for black would be to put the queen maybe on c7, try to trade off pieces, get closer to an endgame and so on. Rook takes e3, of course, it's also something that white needs to do something about. So what Abdelauf noticed here was that he could actually give away that pawn, the pawn on c3. Instead of defending it, he could go for an attack. But not only an attack, rather he goes for some kind of revolution. He will change the pawn structure to his favor here. How did he do that? Well, something about the central pawns. We have a trade involved here. He played a nice move here, bishop e4. Why is that so? Well, because he wants to take. Once he takes on d5, the pawn structure is completely different. We will come to that in the game. I just wanted to say also that there was another way to play here, which, for example, the computer likes very much, knight d4. It wants to play queen g4 and go for an attack. It's perfectly reasonable. I think he must have looked at that also. One theory is that, rook takes e3, queen g4 is very promising for white. And we have this maybe coming up next. But what he maybe might not have liked was bishop g5. That's what I thought was a good move here. But after queen h5, threatening mate, black plays h6. White has no reason to trade bishops. They could keep the bishops instead. But I think this is not so easy to see at the board. Rook takes e3, white could go h4, I think it was, and then the bishop comes back. Bishop is having bishop f4, and black has a hard time defending against bishop takes h6. This was another very promising idea, but if you ask me, it's not evident at the board. So what he played, I think, is actually more thematic. It's something that we can see rather quickly. Bishop e4, very nice idea. Black took the pawn on c3. I looked a little at this, and my impression was that black should start with this, so that if bishop e3, then we take, and then the bishop might be in the way. Comparatively speaking, the bishop is better on f4, so as to not block white's piece on the e file. But okay, that's a minor detail. Let's see what happened in the game. Rook takes e3, white took on d5, e takes d5, and here we have the situation that I wanted to highlight. We have changed the pawn structure with a pawn down, but it's a new pawn structure. You can see there are several issues here. One, weak pawn on d5 that can be attacked. 2, white can play e6 at some point, which will make all their pieces happy, basically. And 3, just like in the example, if you have good memory, you remember this example from the chapter about risks of materialism. We saw the game between Soham with white and who was playing black in that game? Santos, maybe, with black pieces. Something like black went to take a pawn on a4. If you remember, they targeted the bishop and the pawn, and white reacted with knight e4, and they brought the knight to f5, and they had a very strong attack. That's something that could happen here also, because there is not a pawn on e6 anymore, if you see what I mean. In the initial position, black's pawn structure is very solid. For example, white cannot use this square, but in the way they played, bishop e4, rook takes, pawn takes, and now at some point knight e4. You can see that this is indeed an idea for white. They didn't play knight e4 at this point. They started with e6. It's more forcing. Maybe the knight could also take up other tasks. So it's a good move, e6 definitely. Black is already starting to get nervous. One other thing I forgot to say. Please notice that once the game opens, the knight on a5 is not well placed. We saw that also in the game. I think it was Magor Glubam, that when Magor could have sacrificed the pawn in the middle, and in that new Indian structure, if you remember, with double pawns, we talked about that in the chapter about defensive sacrifices, that the knight on a5 was like offside once the position opened, and that happens here again. After e6, rook c4 was played by Spirit in the game, knight d4 played by white. You can see that now knight f5 is also coming at some point. Something going on e6 also. Many things for black to be careful about here. They played in the game f6, and this is basically throwing in the towel, strategically speaking, because now white has this fantastic passed pawn, and they can just continue the attack. This does not help the king at all. It's quite the opposite. It weakens their king's position. But the way to defend this game was very difficult, and actually we're now back in this other chapter about the risks of materialism. We talked a little about computer variations and human variations, that you have this position, the computer tells you it's equal, all right, but the path to equality for black is very difficult, and it consists of only moves, let's say. Then perhaps it's not that equal. I mean, the evaluation itself is equal, but the human task involved, it's very difficult. And that's what Smirian couldn't really handle here. So if I'm not mistaken, what black could have played here was the move bishop c5. He must have completely discarded eliminated this option because of e7. However, here black has this funny tactic. Yeah, if you could see this in the game, congratulations. Now hats off. Queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes. Can you see the chip tactic? Yeah, incredible, but true. Yeah, incredible. Rook takes d4 and rook takes. Black's the whole rook down, but after knight c6, they actually get it back thanks to the pawn on d5. So yeah, that's how you have practical chess versus engine chess. That's how it works. If you can see all this stuff at the board, you're probably close to becoming world champion. So great. For the rest of us, it's difficult to see it. So he didn't play bishop c5, not surprisingly. Knight f5, in any case, this was white could play instead if they want to keep on fighting for the initiative. Rook takes e7, bishop takes, knight takes, king h8. Rook takes d5 and queen a8. This is important for some reason. I think we have to restrict the knight on e7. You would think white is better here, but okay, black has a pawn, and it seems they can hang on, although I wouldn't like to be in black's shoes. In any case, that's the last chance for black. In the game, they played f6, and now white just went for an attack here. The task, speaking again about difficulty, of this or that variation. Now white's task is simple here. Queen f3. We are getting ready to protect the bishop, so we can go knight f5. We're also targeting the pawn on d5. g6. White played a pawn move here. Which pawn move do you think they played? You're completely right. We saw this also on some occasion, h4, trying to softening up the opponent's pawn structure now that they don't have good light square control. Queen c8, h5, knight c6. Black is trying to trade pieces, but it's a little too late, and to bring back the knight into the battle. H takes c6, of course. You can see there are tactics coming up here with queen h5 and rook e3, or maybe queen h5 immediately. Oh, you're right, of course. Yeah, this would give us a chance. Let's check this. Yeah, knight takes d4. Yeah, don't take on h7 because I have king h8, the pawn shield. Yeah, you remember from chapter 23. But we can play it in a different move order. You're completely right. We start with this one so that we have extra flexibility. And if pawn takes, queen takes, it's just a matter of bringing in the rook, I think. Yeah, exactly. Rook d3, and it's basically game over here. So h takes d6, they had to take back. White found a nice sacrifice. The pieces are in good places for that. Knight f5, exactly. This is a great helper. It keeps away black's king. After pawn takes queen g3, you can imagine yourself that white will give check and they will bring up one of the rooks. I think this rook maybe. Oh, the other rook, it seems. Yeah, maybe this one is defending that one. Yeah, so it's better to use this rook. Exactly. So this is not going to work. You got it. Check and rook d3. Again, we are grateful for that little helper on e6. So knight f5, and after queen e8, white played knight e3 simply. Rook c3, and they cashed in on d5, queen takes d5. Yeah, black is not resigning, of course, but it's very difficult for them. White has a very big advantage, you could say, in this position. Black's pieces hardly can't move. You have maybe this move in the pocket also. The bishop, if it moves, there is e7 and so on. So white went on to win. So not a very difficult example, I would say, rather typical, but yet very useful. Bishop e4, white didn't care about protecting that pawn. If you play something passive like bishop d2, black could play knight c4, I think. And yeah, this is the kind of game that they want. But we have to change our mindset and go for revolution. We don't care about losing that pawn. We want to somehow justify our pieces in the center, open up the game for our pieces. That's why we play here bishop e4. It's a very useful trade because it's like a dynamic trade, a trade that changes the pawn structure. Rook takes, bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and here white first played e6, but then they were ready to go for this plan with knight e4. So yeah, nice thinking, dynamic thinking by white in this case. It was definitely worth a pawn to go for this change of the battle, of the nature of the battle. The next example, if you're familiar with the Slav a6, this is like the Chemanenko Slav. You get to this kind of positions, you're slightly restricted. I tried this myself. Many games, I really like it, but it can be difficult, especially when white, they don't let you open up the game. They don't give you activity. They try to slowly grind you down. So what white is probably aiming at here, Maciej with white and Volkov with black. Maciej is probably intending to move forward on the king side, try to squeeze black on that side, leave them without counterplay. But black, in this case Volkov, he found a very nice counter-strike to secure counterplay as soon as possible. Of course, we could consider something like f6. If you thought about that, then that's another good option. It's slightly slower than the game. You can see that you're blocking the bishop. After bishop c3, e5, queen d2, it seems that white can keep the balance here. You can see that white is not going to open up the center just like that. They will wait for black to do it. So I think this could be okay for white still, but by now you know what he played, of course. Aha, Volkov said, all right, I'll give up a pawn because I really want to open up the game. I will change the nature of the battle completely. Exactly, e5. Similar to some openings like the Sicilian Smith-Morra. Now you play d4, cd, and c3. Here it's a similar picture. And after f takes e5, black hurries to play here f6, opening up the game. You can see that if white, they don't accept this, well, they can't play like in the previous line with bishop c3. You can see that it's tactically not the same thing. Something about flexibility. We didn't waste the tempo on f6. We also keep our bishop open. What do you think black would play? Aha, you're right. Pawn takes, and rook e3. This cuts like a knife. This rook, you can see multiple tactical difficulties here for white. So after e5, it's not so easy to see something for white. I think actually they should take with a pawn like that, because I have seen the game. So this is an easy conclusion to make. This is very nice for black strategically, in structural terms and so on. The pawn structure is now much better, of course. They have doubled pawns. We can maybe remove this knight and push the pawn and so on, but still it was better than the game. Else, if you don't believe me, look at what happened in the game, please. F takes e5, black played f6, their main plan here. You can see that they're ready to open up the game. White took on f6, we take with the knight, so that we have the knight coming to e4 and we keep bishop h6 in the pocket. By now white's a pawn up, but you can see that the strategical map, so to speak, has changed completely. The static balance, it definitely doesn't favor them anymore. They're sitting with weaknesses and so on. Rook e1 was played in the game. Black could play in different ways, but queen c7 was a very clever move. We are using the queen on this diagonal where there is no real defender. You can see white's bishop. It's not one of the best pieces you can have. White played at this point bishop c3. Maybe what Maciej had planned was e4, but you can see there's a sneaky move here. If you consider that the queen is protecting the bishop, could we somehow exploit this liability? You're right. We can play here knight c2. Very smart tactic. That definitely Volkov would have seen in the game. You can see that after queen takes g3, black has a very strong attack in that case. Or they get back the pawn. Yeah, that's something like that. Queen takes, queen g2. Black will take on g2, and then take on e4, I think. And question to you, when they take on e4, let's say they take on e4 at this point, how would you take back? We take with the pawn, right? So that we create a target here and we can push this pawn. No matter what happens here, we can safely say that black is having the upper hand. Another plan might be to attack this pawn also. You can just compare the two bishops and you can easily see that it's black who has the better one, right? Like the master and slave in this case, as for this pawn on d4. So yeah, in the game they played bishop c3 instead, but still it was a difficult game. Volkov used the same tactic that we just saw. Queen takes, check. Queen g2 will be met by rook e3, and the same goes for bishop g2. Yeah, if they play queen g2, we could just play the same move here. You can see complete destruction here of white's position. This is a problem child in the very end. They will always suffer for this pawn. That becomes evident as soon as black managed to break the center. That pawn on d4, like a typical weakness. So after bishop g2, black played rook takes e3. Now the bishop is hanging on c3. White played rook takes after queen takes. King h2, yeah, they couldn't interpose the queen because the bishop is hanging. And here black brought another piece to the attack. Who do you think joined the attack? You would say the rook, but there is something even stronger. Exactly. Bishop h6, you got it. Bishop f4 is coming next. Then we have queen g3. We could also include the rook at some point with rook e8. Very difficult game for white. So basically what black did here, they noticed that time is money. They can speed up the revolution here. f6 and e5, that was the right mindset, you could say. But we can speed it up. If we start with e5, it's actually much more powerful this way. And after d takes e5, he played here f6. Yeah, very nice thinking by Volkov. In this way, we are definitely putting pressure on white. It's not easy for them to handle this anymore. And you can see that also their rooks are a little offside. Now they should be in the center instead. So they are like paying the price a little for what can I say, neglecting the center or something. So nice, very opportune play by Sergei Volkov. Let's check our next example, where I think we have a different situation with less pieces on the board. And even in this kind of late middle games and early end games, you can come across this kind of thinking. So it's interesting that there were actually two ways to make a revolution here. Unfortunately, in the game, this game between Babula with white and Zardon with black, unfortunately, Zardon didn't apply either of these two opportunities. He played in the game rook d7, simple move protecting the pawn on b7, but white correctly took on f6. So they gave away that bishop. Why? Well, they have seen that after queen takes f6, they are very fast with seizing the only open file in the position. Of course, they played here the move rook c1, I was going to say, but they actually played queen b5 first, targeting these two guys. And after queen f5, now they played rook c1. This is how the game went, and it was very difficult for black to defend here. You can see that white has a healthier pawn structure. Their pieces are better placed also. They're more active. So difficult for black. They played in the game rook d6. That was queen takes b7. White won a pawn after king h7. They actually traded queens here with queen b1. This was a very clever move, as you can see. Now they are simply transposing into a one rook endgame. After king g6, is that what they played? Yeah, king g6, they played white quickly, took on f5 and played rook c7. They were a pawn up and they have a more active rook, so it's safe to say, difficult to save this game with black. So that was a bad outcome for black. You can see again that if you play passively with rook d7, white will take on f6, eliminating that knight from the board, which means that after queen takes, white will have you could say, a better heavy piece endgame, but specifically because they're able to take the file. You could probably take it here also, but he played queen b5 first, so probably to tie up black to all their weaknesses now, you could say. something like that, queen f5, and then rook c1. So complete nightmare for black. They ended up with the wrong pieces, you could say, on the board. We were a little back in the previous chapter about positional defense. In this or that pawn structure, try to identify which pieces should stay and which pieces can go. So in this case, I would actually say none of them should go. They should all stay. Maybe the rook can go, but the knight and the queen, both of them should definitely stay, in my way of seeing things here. So what they could have played here, which was much stronger, was to play knight e4. This, of course, the reason why they didn't play it is because they are giving away a pawn. This is difficult for most of us. So the knight e4, white could then take on b7. Now we're a pawn down, but now we have activity. Now we have somehow managed to change the logic of the position. And if you allow me one observation here, if you look at this initial position, somebody asks you, is this bishop a good bishop or is it a bad bishop? You would say, probably it's a good bishop. No, it's an open diagonal. It's attacking on both sides. And I agree. It's also on the protected square, right? It's protected by the pawn. But at the same time, you could also say, if there is something going on, like behind the bishop, if you see what I mean, if there's something going on, like over here on those squares, well, in that case, the bishop is not so useful anymore. The bishop would have been better off, let's say, on e1, which looks very passive, but for defensive purposes, it's a better place. And we saw something like this, something slightly similar. If you remember the game in the chapter about defensive sacrifices, where with Pichot, with white, and Julio Granda with the black pieces. Maybe you remember that Pichot sacked exchange. He did something like rook takes f5. Is that what he did? He sacked exchange somehow. There was some, I think it was rook takes f5, and then he traded queens with queen g1. They ended up in an end game where white was playing on the queen side. Black had a typical Caro-Kann bishop on f5 and had a pawn on e6. Unfortunately, the bishop couldn't come back anymore and help in the queenside defense. So that's something that can happen here also. The bishop looks great on e5, but indeed, if there is a battle like behind that bishop, it won't be so useful anymore. So maybe that can also explain why this move is so strong. Knight e4, because simply that bishop, it looks great for some things, but for other things, it's not really that useful. Queen takes b7, we will, of course, never in our life trade queens here. We will play here something like queen d3 or queen e2. I think queen d3 was smarter because we're hitting the pawn on a3 also. Queen b2, and we can simply continue here with, exactly, not difficult to see this move. We play here rook c8, so that the rook can come to c2 also. White could stop that with rook c1, but if you remember what we talked about dynamic exchanges in the previous chapter about we can trade pieces in different ways, but some trades alter the pawn structure. The next move will be easy for you. That's completely right. We don't need to take on c1. Even that, I think, would be okay for black due to white's strange bishop on e5, but even stronger here, rook c4. And I think actually the pressure is on white here. One idea that black is toying with here is to play queen b3. We're talking about setting up passed pawns and things like that, tactical complications. Another idea might be to play at some point knight c3 with tactics coming up. So, yeah, black is a pawn down, but I think they have plenty of activity. And the nature of the battle is not the same anymore. Not like in the game where white had, you could say, complete command of the position. Here, black has plenty of counterplay. So this would have been a good option, which I think would have at least saved the game for black. Another very interesting option here at this point was to play this move, rook c8. I mean, the move itself, it's not spectacular. What comes next was a little, you could say, surprising that he didn't play this for an obvious reason. You don't need to be very good with chess psychology to understand this. He didn't play this because he didn't like bishop takes f6. And if we take with the queen, well, they will just take on b7. I think this is the reason. Queen takes and queen takes b7. Yeah, we don't want to take on b7 straight away because then I think there will be some tactics with rook c1 or something. Yeah, this is maybe unnecessary for white, but it's smarter for them to play bishop takes f6. And if queen takes, we can take on b7. But actually what black can do here, and I think this was Stockfish who told me this, they can actually take with a pawn here. This is very interesting now. What an ugly pawn structure. How can we accept those double pawns like that? But it's just like in this game that I mentioned to you, where Dorfman was playing with the white pieces versus Paunovic, where he actually doubled all his pawns to set up a passed pawn. It's something like that. But okay, there is a tactical explanation also, because if now white takes on b7, what do you think black would play? How would they end up on the better side of this endgame? That's right, they can combine some different tactical motives here. Rook c1 first, and after king h2, it's important to play the moves in the right order. First, queen d6, It's not an attacking move. It's about taking the pawn on a3 so that we can set up a passed pawn. Right, so g3, and now we take on b1 and queen takes a3. Only black could be better in this endgame. Maybe white can make a draw, but they will suffer a little for it. And the double pawn is not really that, you could say, tangible. Okay, it would have been nicer to have him on g6, but it's not the end of the world. So after this interesting idea, g takes f6, but I think it's difficult to play this in the game. If somebody played this, I would be very surprised. I would really admire them if they found this. White will have to play something else like queen b4, and we can play b5 with the same idea of queen takes, and that is rook c1. Interesting. They can play something else, but you can see that in the long run we have something going on with this pawn. We would like to attack it one way or another. We're sitting with these weaknesses, but it seems white, they don't have the right pieces to exploit that. You can see that they're missing a knight, for example, to work on those weaknesses. So yeah, that's another approach, but okay, I will stick to this first one, which seems simpler to me. Knight e4. We keep our very important knight. We don't care about losing that pawn. By the way, if they played f3, I just wanted to single out this also, they would actually stop our plans. This is a valid move by white, but we can do here is knight e6. And as Ulf Andersson said, every pawn move implies some kind of weakness now. So even if white now takes on d6, it's not the same thing as in the game because they played f3. That makes a huge difference on the strategical battle. In the game, black's rook was passive, but now if white takes the open file, we can of course play something like rook e8. We now have a nice file for our rook because we're attacking something, right? So every pawn move makes a difference. This would not be that bad for black, I think, because we have targets for our pieces and so on. It's not the same as the game. So yeah, interesting example, something about, we're coming back to the previous chapter, something about knowing which pieces to keep and which pieces should stay and so on. And don't be afraid of giving up a pawn, please. That's not the end of the world. Look for active counterplay. In this case, queen d3 was one key idea. Rook c1 was, sorry, rook c8, that was another one. Oh, rook c1 I was looking at also. Yeah, then queen d3, this is what I looked at, it seems. And we have some tactics coming up here also if the rook leaves. Else our queen is in an active place. Yeah, something like that. So yeah, interesting. Something to remember. Knight e4, keeping the strong knight and preparing counterplay. We don't care so much about this little pawn on b7. In our next example, we will look at something which is even more, you could say, surprising, or what would be the right word. In this game, we are sitting with the white pieces. It's Haira Petyan with white, and it's Sargsyan with the black pieces. You would say, what a mess for white, what a disaster. We lost the bishop pair, our king is weak, we have this weak pawn on f4, they have a monster bishop on d4. What's going on here? How did we end up this badly? But it isn't that bad, you know. It isn't that bad, but you have to play in a truly revolutionary spirit to keep the balance here. Let's check what happened in the game. I think white was honestly already depressed by how the game went. He played in the game here the move b3. I perfectly understand this move. We protect this pawn, we get ready to play knight c2. That's, I would say, typical evolutionary, if you could say that, thinking, like evolution, slowly improving. But that's what Dorfman said that the other players should do. We should go for revolution. We don't have time for this because the dynamic balance is not to our favor. Okay, I'm simplifying a little, but let's see what happened in the game. They played here queen h4, targeting the pawn on f4. White played queen f3, and black hit the white center very quickly here with f5. Very nice move, because now bishop e7 is coming up. Also, they are increasing the pressure on white's camp. It's very difficult to defend already with white. They tried in the game king h2 prophylaxis, but after bishop e7, it was already impossible to keep the material balance here with white. They tried queen g3. Please notice how they never have time to really bring in the knight as they wanted. Black took on f2, and after bishop takes, queen takes, bishop takes, black got the pawn for free, and they later on went on to win. You can see that this pawn is also hanging. So this was a little disaster what struck white in the game, but they could actually have kept the balance here, I think, or at least they could have made things more difficult for black in practice. So if we go back to what they were intending here, they were intending to go knight c2, which is very logical because the knight is out of place, and we would ultimately like to play something like e5. This would be a game changer. If you can make e5 happen, definitely we're talking revolution. So what white could have done here, there was like a shortcut here. They could start with this move, knight c2. Of course, he didn't play this because he didn't like bishop takes b2. Yeah, I looked also at other moves like bishop g7, and in this case, we could play knight e3. We have already gained time on the clock and so on, or well, not on the clock, sorry, time in the position. We are now faster, but in the other variation, we have e5 coming up, d6 is slightly weak and so on. Yeah, this is what I looked. Queen h4 and pinning and hitting the pawn. Now we can actually trade queens because after queen takes, pawn takes, again, we have pressure on this pawn, and it's, yeah, not that bad anymore, the position. We have something with e5 coming up also at some point, perhaps. So critical here, of course, that black takes the pawn, bishop takes b2. Let's take it again in slow motion here. Knight c2, white hurries to improve the knight. After bishop takes b2, they are down a pawn, but they have something going on here. Can you find white's clever move here? Hint, if you could eliminate that bishop pair, it would be great. Aha, that's right. We have this little nice tactic, knight b4, discovered attack against the bishop. We're hitting two bishops at the same time now, so black will have to save one of them. If they try to save the good bishop with bishop takes c4, we can actually take on, how does this variation go? We take on c4, and when they take on b4, we take back on b4, and we're hitting the pawn on d6. When they go bishop g7, there is some kind of tactic with bishop f8 maybe, but if you go e5, then it's a different story. And I think white is perhaps even better in this position. It's getting interesting for white now. Suddenly white's bishop, that sleeping bishop, is suddenly waking up. So this would be interesting for white. So c takes b4 is more critical, but now, as you can see, black has... they're losing their good bishop, so to speak. Queen takes b2, no matter what happens next, it's a definite strategical victory for white that they have managed to take black's King's Indian bishop, and now they have nice control of the dark spots. But okay, they're also 2 pawns down. Bishop takes e4, queen takes b4, we're hitting the pawn on d6. Black could play here queen c7. I looked at rook takes d6. I thought this was interesting that actually black is happy to give away that pawn to speed up counterplay. They would later on like to push these pawns. They have a nice queenside pawn majority, but white can play in a different way. They can start with rook d4. They win a tempo here with the rook. They're getting ready to double on the d file in this way. And after bishop takes e2, we play queen d2, hitting the bishop and the pawn, but we're actually not interested in the pawn. We're interested in something else. Can you guess what we're interested in? Well, I talked about this in the introduction. An attack at the king, it will overrule anything else in the position. So even if we're dead lost on the queen side, we should just take our chances on the king side. So you could start with f5. This is the most logical move, but I think there was some kind of flexibility gain if we start with h4 instead. Yeah, maybe we want to push this pawn first, or maybe we don't need it to set up some pressure on black's camp. So if h5 now stopping the pawn, now for sure we will go f5, and as you can see, queen h6 is coming up. Problems on the sky here for black. So maybe after h4 they will go for their attack instead. They will play b5. Yeah, long term we're doomed, of course, but okay, we will continue the attack. So at this point, I think, yeah, analyzing with the computer, it was not saying that white is better or anything, but it was like so. It didn't give a definite verdict, and that's usually a good sign. If your material down, that the computer is not saying that you're lost, that's a good sign that you have compensation, because if the computer cannot see how to face that attack, you can bet that the human won't have it so easy either. So h5, we're going to play f5 next turn. We're going to do something here. We're not completely sure exactly how it's going to happen, but we have some plans there. You can see that also we can bring in more pieces to the attack if necessary. So white's 2 pawns down, but they have plenty of activity in this position. It won't be that trivial, I think. They remove the queens, yeah, of course, black is winning, but with queens on, there will always be chances here. There are not many defenders on black's king side, so yeah, that's an interesting example. Very, very difficult. I definitely don't blame Hajrapetyan for not playing like this. It's very, what can I say, far-fetched to play like that, but I think it works. I think it's the best chance. Knight c2, we give up the b-pawn so that we can go knight b4, and we start some kind of metamorphosis in the position. We take their bishop, we try to push e5, or we try to attack them on the king side. That would be the plan here. Okay, time to move on. We talked about giving up a pawn. Here we gave up a pawn, but we can also give up other things. We saw many exchange sacrifices in chapter 20. Yeah, which one was that? The one with the defensive exchanges. No, defensive sacrifices. Maybe chapter 27 or something like that, if you remember. But here I wanted to show you also that in the strictly strategical battle without king safety involved, we can still rely on this idea. So here we have an example. Actually, it is touching a little upon king safety, so I'm not completely right. But okay, you will see what I mean. Black has just played here d4 in this game between with the white pieces Donchenko, and playing black is Garibian. So when black plays d4 in this kind of reversed, yeah, what is it really? No, it's not a reversed. It's a Tarrasch, I think, like a queen's gambit, a Tarrasch variation, something like that. When they play d4, black's plan is clear. They would like to soften up white's dark squares. If white takes a number of times on d4, you can see that if knight takes, they take back. Let's say white takes with the bishop. Yeah, bishop takes, pawn takes. Black will, of course, not take on d4 because we have this cheap tactic now. But look at the dark squares in white's camp. Something like knight h5 maybe. The knight will come here, the queen will come there. This is a complete mess for white. Very ugly structure. Now, strategical balance. Yeah, I don't know what Dorfman would say about this, but yeah, he wouldn't be happy about this with the white pieces. So that should not be done. Also, if you take with the pawn instantly, black can play something like rook e8. Yeah, developing the pieces and getting ready to hit white on the king side with knight h5, I don't know, queen h4. Even bishop e8 could come up at some point. Rook transfers and so on. Yeah, not convincing for white. So what to do then? Yeah, we don't want to play e4 either. We could play e4. If we had a chance to go f4, it would be great. But here, black could play the same move, I think, rook e4, so as to hold up f4, and then we could play rook e8, and then play knight h5 and play in the same way. Strategically, this would be at least dubious for white, this kind of position. Oh, I actually looked at this. I didn't say rook e8. I said knight h5. Okay, this is perhaps even better. Yeah, you're right, of course. No need for rook e8, because after f4 we can go queen h4 and we're basically winning a pawn here. And yeah, if we want that pawn, or we can do something else. But yeah, I think that's what we're going to do here. Yeah, play for an attack. So, back to business here. What do you think Donchenko did? I think he saw very quickly which was the best move. And he said, yeah, I should not compromise my pawn structure. I don't want to let black carry out their ideas, attacking my king and getting a dark square grip and so on. So what he did, he completely, you could say, repainted the strategical map here. He took on c6. This is very nice. It's not winning material, and he's losing material rather. Rook takes c6, but after b takes c6, knight takes d4. You can easily now see that things have changed. White will never end up with pawn on d4 anymore. Well, never say never, but it's highly unlikely. So we keep a very good pawn structure like this. This means that we can push this pawn, we can keep the knight, we can use it for aggressive means. And it's even black who should be a little careful as for king safety. If we can move the king somewhere like h2 or h1 and play rook g1, we will have more chances for an attack. Okay, I should tell you that this position is, objectively, it's about equal, but still, I think white has an easier game here. It's like they have taken the initiative, you could say. They have the initiative. It's not a secure advantage, but it's like having some greater influence on the battle. So black took on d4, correct choice, giving up the bishop. Sometimes they say if your opponent has the bishop pair, it doesn't matter if you give up the bishop again, something like that, because they already have the bishop pair. But here what we're talking about mainly is that knight f5 was coming. Queen d5, for example, centralizing. Knight f5 is very strong. You can see there is something here. And maybe there is some kind of danger on, on the light squares also. So dark squares. So knight takes d4, bishop takes, and black played here queen d5. I looked also at queen d6, but my conclusion was that white could also look a little on the queen side here, something like queen c2, rook fd8, so that white doesn't get in bishop c5, and now simply rook c1. We don't take this pawn on h7, right? We don't need that pawn. We are interested in the queen side now. So we're putting pressure on their queen side. You can see that queen takes c6 is hanging. In the endgame, the bishop pair would be a great asset. And at the same time, you can see that if they defend the pawn, I think they're actually giving away the pawn on a6. So this looks very promising for white. In the game, for that reason, they played queen d5 instead. Now they're touching the pawn on f3 if white moves their queen. But at the same time, we should notice that bishop takes f6 is also a possibility for white, doubling black's pawn. So it's like, what can you say? A trade-off, no? When you put the queen on d5 or d6, some advantages and some disadvantages. Yeah, speaking about which we don't want to take on f6 right now, this is not clear that we can really profit from this at this point. We can keep that in the pocket. That bishop is really strong, so let's keep him at least until they play c5. So what he played here in the game, Donchenko, was f4. I wrote a little about this in Mastering Chess Strategy. When you have doubled pawns, it's very nice to move the upper one because the lower one still keeps like control of the weak squares and so on. So f4 is a good move for several reasons. One is that we open up a path for our queen. I think that's what Donchenko noticed, that he can use the queen later on in an attack. If, for example, we are taking on f6 or something like that. But also we can use this square on e5 for the bishop later on. So good move, f4. Black played in a game rook fd8, and after king h2, you can see now white's carrying out the plan that we talked about. They can now play rook d1. It's good for this reason also to have f4 in, so that there is no check on d6 and so on. Black had a difficult game here. They had to find this move queen d6. Yeah, slightly unexpected that you move the queen again, but I think the point was to play c5 and be able to take back on f6. So I looked a little at this, long variation here, but queen b1 was my point here. We played this to try to play c5. To play b4 to control the square on c5. But still, this would be like dynamically balanced. Now black could fight back with c5. Now they lose the pawn on h7, but after bishop takes, queen takes, bishop takes, king f8, black is probably okay in this position. Balanced, I would say. White has 2 pawns for the exchange, so they're probably not worse, but okay, black is also fairly active. This is what black should have played, but this was not easy to see through. They played c5 in the game. Big problem with this move is that now suddenly white gets a strong attack. Bishop takes f6, you can see no chance for queen takes because the rook is hanging. So g takes, queen check on g4 after king f8. White played here the correct move, bishop c4. I think this is what maybe black underestimated in the game. They thought perhaps that white would go after this pawn, but in that case, as you can see, king e7 and black is very safe. So bishop c4, very opportune attacking move by Donchenko. In this way, he gets ready to attack the pawn on f7 at some moment. After queen c6, what would you play here with white pieces? How can you speed up white's attack? You got it. Rook g1, of course, we're playing for an attack. The queen is threatening to enter. Black played king e7. You can see the prophylactic king move that we saw in chapter 10, I think it was, moving the king in advance. And here white played a nice move. Yeah, queen g7 comes natural, but actually it's better to put the queen here for a simple reason. If we do this, we actually help the rook to enter also. So very clever thinking by white. On top of it, they're also tying down black's queen to the c5 pawn. Rook d2, counterattack coming up. Else it was just very difficult. Rook f8 and white will go rook g7. Looks disastrous now. Please notice white will always keep the queens on. It's okay to trade the rooks, but queens should of course stay due to black's weak king. So after queen h5, they played rook d2, last counterattack. Queen takes, king d6. And here I like very much the next move that white played here. Yeah, very, very precise move. They played at this point. You would say in the first place, oh, of course, I just take and I win the endgame. But what Donchenko noticed was that we can play in a more flexible way, not giving them any chance to sneak away with the king. We can start exactly with rook g7. So now we threaten to take. I think there is also mate coming up. Of course, what he saw was that if rook takes, there is nothing going on here if we go king g1. That's, I think, how the game ended. It ended one move earlier, sorry. And black resigned because they are getting mated here. So interesting. What we saw here was that black had pushed d4, logical move, trying to soften up white's dark squares, but white knew the right way to respond. They found the correct rejoinder. They played here rook takes c6. Very nice exchange, sacrifice. After b takes, knight takes. The structure is very good for white now. You could say somehow the strategical map has changed. It's white who is, white is material down, but they have a lot of activity. Their pawn structure is also pleasant for them. They avoided what would have happened here in the other line that we talked about. This kind of mess, this is not what we want. Definitely queen h4 and things like that. It's much nicer what we played in the game. It costs the change, but it's worth it. Just like in the previous examples, it can be worth material investment to change the nature of the battle. B takes c6 and knight takes d4. Very nice. Maybe not objective advantage for white, but very nice initiative that we have right now. Okay, let's take an example from older times. Let's see another kind of material transaction. In this old game between Jansa with white pieces and Gligoric playing black, one of my favorite players, Svetozar Gligoric, you can see that Gligoric, Rai Lopez, didn't really end up in the best possible way. He's restricted. This bishop is just looking at the d5 pawn. White's having an initiative on the queen side, they would like to maybe play something like a4 and start targeting the pawn on a5, or maybe bring the knight to c4. Maybe that's even better. And also we have no chance of playing f5 here. White has a lot of presence on on the king side. So what Grigoris noticed was that it was time for revolution. You got it. And he actually gave up one piece for 2 pawns here. He gave up a piece for 2 pawns. Yeah, but now you know the move, of course. You got it, knight takes d5. With either knight, either one is fine. The chess engine is not completely happy about this, but I'm convinced that in practical play, this simply has to be the right choice. Unless you play against Stockfish, of course. E takes d5, knight takes d5. You can see that already now there are several interesting ideas for black. White played bishop b2. We could play knight f4. This is perhaps what would have been the best choice to play here the move queen c7. Very precise move because we want to push d5. It seems that white cannot stop this, and I would say that actually black is okay here in this position. But in the game they played instead queen b6. It's also a good move, developing move. We're getting ready to bring in the rook also. White played here knight e4. This was not a good idea. They should have played a4 instead. One point of this move is that we keep the bishop here where it stops rook e8. If white can somehow prevent the move d5, I think they will be better here. 2 pawns might not be enough for a whole piece in this case. So I looked a little at this knight f4, queen d1, but since this pawn is always hanging, I think that indeed white is a bit better here. But okay, it's a long game. It has just started, you could say. You can look for different ways to develop your initiative here. Maybe you can, I don't know, put your rook on d8, the queen there, and maybe then you can resume this idea of d5, something like that. But in the game, they played instead knight e4. This was not a good idea. I understand that Jansa wanted to improve his knight, but this will just give black an easier task, pushing d5. So after knight e4, black retreated the knight with tempo. After they could also play, by the way, knight f4. After bishop a4, black pushed the pawns d5. Now it's easy to understand this game. Knight ed2. Interestingly, the best move was to go back, but for humans this is very difficult. Where the knight came from, if we go back, we feel like it's ridiculous to play like that. But this would have been better, actually. e4, the point is that after bishop takes, king takes, we can go knight h4. We talked about this before. Counterplay. White is trying to get counterplay. They're hitting the king. We were saying this is a very valid idea when we are facing long-term difficulties. Not that white is better or anything, but at least they have something to play for. In the game, they played knight ed2, and from here on, black's game is actually rather simple. They play e4. You can say that when pawns... when you have sacked a piece for 2 pawns, it's very nice if they're connected, especially if they're central, like in this case. If they're distributed, like one on this side and one on the other side, it's not the same thing. But here they're extremely powerful. So it's like a dream situation when you have sacrificed a piece for 2 pawns. e4, bishop takes, king takes, knight h2, knight e6. We can see that now this is coming up. Maybe that is coming up, but basically d4 is the move we want to play, of course. Maybe we can prepare it with f5 also to continue to run with those pawns. Rook ac1, white had black had different options here. This was one interesting idea. Actually, white can make a revolution here. Queen e3 and after knight d3. What do you think white should play here? You got it. Revolution time. Queen takes, pawn takes, rook takes e7. Who knows what will happen here, but it's better than what happened in the game, like slow death for white. Here we have some counterplay. Maybe we can bring in the knight. Yeah, in the best of scenarios, of course, but we can try at least. While in the game, after f5, yeah, Grigoris, he doesn't give him any chance here to cook up counterplay. f3 was played in the game. This was not a good idea because now suddenly there are problems on the dark squares. But even so, it was a difficult game for white. Black would continue to push d4, I guess, d4, d3, maybe put a knight on d4 and so on. So f3, c4 check, of course. We're taking the opportunity to bring in the queen a little closer. Queen f2 was played in the game after queen takes, king takes. Wow, so many black pawns in the middle here. Knight c5 was played in the game. Pretty move. You can see targeting the d3 square. White took on e4, and after knight e3, king e2, knight takes e1, rook takes e1. Black has so many pawns here, so that is really no chance for white to save this game. C takes b3. We can take next turn on e4. After bishop takes. He even played bishop a6 first. Interesting, to improve the bishop. And after king e3, he took on e4. Which pawn do you think he used? Yeah, of course, that's a silly question. With the d pawn, of course, to keep them all intact. We don't let them take. And as you can see, one nice plan here for black is to do something like that. You could find endgames where 2 pieces fight successfully against rook and 2 pawns. But this is probably not one of them because, like I'm saying, the pawns are so well distributed. They're in a chain here, and we have passed pawn scenario coming up. So that's the big difference here. So what happened here in this example is that Gligoric noticed that he was in trouble, long-term trouble, passive position. The opponent has a space advantage. It's not easy to find an active plan. So he decided, all right, I will really have to take the bull by the horns. And he played here knight b, d takes c5. Very, very nice. Perhaps not completely convincing if you ask the computer, but in practical play, I think it was the best choice. After pawn takes, knight takes, he moves away the knight, and then he's getting ready to push the d-pawn and the e-pawn. This would be the main plan here. The connected pawns are very strong. Okay, it's time to have a look at our last example, where I wanted to show you something about positional concessions, but not giving away material, but rather something like accepting a worse pawn structure, softening up the square for the opponent, something like that, in order to help a revolution. And in this last example, we have with the white pieces Wang Jue, and playing black is Balog. So we can see that we have this typical Nimzo Indian structure where white has played d takes e5, black took back on e5, and what white is planning here next is easy to see. Aha, you got it. A typical knight maneuver. They would like to go knight f1, knight e3, knight e5. So you would say in the first place that, oh, the black must be better here according to the strategical balance. But it's actually not true, because when the knight arrives at d5, it's a very unpleasant position for black, because they can't do the same thing. They can't put the knight on d4 because we have the pawn on c3. So basically, if you play something normal here in the game, actually they played knight d8, trying to play in new like evolution style. White played knight f1, and after bishop c6 there was queen c2. Knight b7, you can see that black understood, of course, what was coming. Balog wanted to prepare knight d6 after taking on d5. So after knight e3, g6, knight e5, he would be ready to take on d5 and then play knight e6. But even so, white will have a nicer game here. I don't remember exactly what happened in the game, but we can imagine now if they take, we take with a c pawn, they can play knight e6, but we can play c4. Black is solid, but white will always be a little better here. They can look for ways to open up the game. Basically, one good plan would be to maybe put the bishop on this side and try to push f4 at the right moment. Okay, after a lot of preparation, of course. Another idea might be to try to create a weakness on the queen side by means of a4, a5. But what black could have done here was a very unexpected idea. They could have completely changed the logic of the battle by you could say, pawn break, or I'm not sure if it's a pawn break, but something about changing the nature of the battle. Yeah, that will have to do. So g5, very, very surprising move. Why on earth would you play that? You're giving on top of it, you give white this square. Sorry. The point is that what we're going to do here, we're going to play g4. We'll put a knight on g5. And at that moment, you can see that the pawn on e4 will be very weak. We will try to take that pawn and trade off the bishops, and suddenly, in the best of scenarios, white's king will be a bit exposed. So that's what they played here, the move g5. Very interesting. I mean, in my example, they played g5. g4 would not be a nice idea, because you're just inviting black's knight to the middle, and yeah, you can see black would just maybe go for counterplay and so on. Would be dangerous for white to let the knight enter on f4 just like that. So what could white play here? They could play h3 to stop this plan, but okay, we can just resume it with g4. So basically white cannot avoid, they cannot avoid this plan. I looked at some different moves, but the most logical to me was knight f1, so that we continue with this thing with the knights. But this time maybe it won't go to d5. Maybe the knight will go to f5 instead. So, okay, black will continue with that idea, g4, trying to soften up the pawn. If white takes, of course, we're happy to take on e4. This is easy to understand. Now it's a completely different pawn structure. You can see suddenly black has a passed pawn. Suddenly there are chances of an attack against white's king and so on. So this is not so nice for white. So after g4, probably white will play knight e3, and they will rely on bringing the knight to f5. I mean, after all, that's the price that black is paying here, right? That's the big concession by this move, g5. You would say, if somebody told you, hey, g5 is the best move here, you would say, no, that's not true. Ulf Andersson said that every pawn move creates a weakness, right? And if you play g5, you can never fight for f5 again. Yeah, it would be interesting to hear Ulf's opinion about this move, g5, by the way. It looks ugly, but it's actually very powerful. Knight f1, g4, knight e3, we take on f3, g takes f3. As you can see, if white takes back straight away, we have a fork here, right? We don't take the pawn, we can actually include this move, and we can take next turn instead, and then we have the knight in a very active place, like bishop g2, bishop takes e4, and if they take, I think we will take with this knight, so that we keep the ideas with the other knight. Oh, sorry, the other knight, right? It can go to f3 and h3, so this is not so nice for white. G takes f3, knight f5 is what I looked at, wins an important tempo. Queen f8, but it's actually not so bad for black, this situation. After bishop takes f3, again you can see we have knight g5, and we can take on e4 next turn, and the queen is holding up quite well, I would say, on the king side. Nothing really going on that side. So after queen f8, an interesting move for white would be here bishop e3. You can see what's going on here. They're actually targeting the pawn on h6, trying to trap our queen. I looked at the crazy move f takes d2. I couldn't really understand what was going on here after bishop takes h6, bishop takes e4, bishop takes knight g5. Crazy position, not clear what's going on. But if we look for a safer, yeah, you can see there is mate, so I'm coming up here. But if you look at something safer, it would be after bishop e3 to simply play knight g5. We're sticking to the same plan. So probably white will have to take on g5. That's already a small victory for black. Trade off their bishop pair. Bishop takes, pawn takes. They could take now on f3. And yeah, we should be a little careful in this position. There was some problem with taking the pawn on e4. Yeah, we shouldn't do that for some reason. Not that I really remember it, but maybe our king will be in trouble if we do that. Possibly if we take on e4, they can take back and they can maybe play something like queen c6. This looks a little unpleasant. No, we should probably not be that materialistic. There is something with queen f6 coming up next. I can't really honestly see all the variations, but if I could avoid this with black, I would rather avoid it. So a nicer way to play here, I think, is simply bishop c8. Try to trade off this bishop. Now we're back on the page of the previous chapter about positional defense. Try to trade off the opponent's most powerful pieces. So bishop c8, if they go knight d6, if they go knight e6, we can play here rook d8, and we are still managing to trade off the knight. So they could play something like knight e3 instead, and in this case we can continue with our kingside play. We can start with g4 so that we open up some space for the queen, and after bishop g2 we can first play bishop e6 so that we can take on d5 with the bishop perhaps to keep our strong knight, and later on we can consider to play queen h6 playing on the dark square. So this would be the final result, you could say, of black's little operation here. They had a situation here which didn't look that nice for them. White had this automatic plan of knight f1, knight e3, knight e5. But by means of the extremely unexpected move g5, they can actually bring about some kind of revolution here. They don't really care about weakening the square on f5. They get ready to play g4 very quickly, try to create counterplay, soften up the pawn on e4. That was black's key idea in this example. All right, so let's make a quick recap of what we have seen here in terms of revolution. First, we saw how Panzulaya broke, you could say the center, broke up white center with e3 and d4, going from an inferior pawn structure into a superior pawn structure in typical, you could say, French style, but it was one file to the left, no, like Benoni style, you could probably say. And then we saw in the next example how Akobian managed to open up the center. There was a stronghold for black. Everything revolved around that d4 square, but he was able to trade off the pieces and ultimately bring about the move d4, which was very, very important in this case. But it was interesting to notice that he actually waited a little with d4 until he could force black's knight to d7, and then it was even more powerful, the d4 break. We saw how Liang could have got an interesting position here, no material advantage, but after the moves here, bishop f4, pawn takes, knight takes, sorry, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, he would have a nice position here with queen e6. Somehow this pawn structure is not so nice for white. They are really missing the light square bishop. How could they have reached this? Well, by using this interesting move order with bishop takes d3 instead of e4, but it was a complex tactical variation, safe to say. So what he played was, could have played was bishop takes and e4, and then after queen f1, the key move here was to play knight e5 so that we can really make sure that white's bishop leaves the board. We saw in this game Hava Shengelia that Shengelia's best chance had to do about creating a pass pair on the queen side. That's where white didn't have many pieces, and it was a natural area to look for counterplay, to bring about this revolution, you could say, change the nature of the battle completely. We saw how Arlov used this nice trade on d5 to change the pawn structure. It cost him a pawn, but he managed to really create new opportunities for his pieces and so on. He opened the game. Black's knight on a5 was a little absent from the battle. We saw something similar, central break by Volkov. He sacked the pawn, but he managed to open up the game. White's weaknesses on the dark squares and also on the light squares actually take their toll in the end. It was difficult for white to defend here. It seems to me that white should have been careful about this option. They should not have brought their rooks to the queen side. They should have kept at least one rook in the center. So very nice operation. Don't be afraid to give up a pawn if you can see that this can lead you into a favorable pawn structure. We saw this early endgame example, late middle game, that the knight was very powerful. We should try to keep it even at the cost of a pawn on b7 to create counterplay and even consider some passed pawn scenario on the queen side. We saw that white had this very difficult position, but with some funny looking tactics, they could have been able to turn the tables, get into a combative position where they would have counterplay against black's king. We said that an attack at the king was very often one of the best chances when you were in long time difficulties. We saw Donchenko carry out a typical exchange sacrifice. In this way, they were able to correctly resist against white's dark square play, and it was actually black's king which was turning into a target later on in this game. We saw how Gligoric didn't shy away from giving away a knight for 2 pawns because these pawns were connected. He was able to push them forward. It was a completely different kind of battle than what he could have had if he just played on in a normal way, like evolution, trying to improve the pieces and so on. Here it was much more fun, you could say, definitely for black to play this position with the rolling pawns and so on. And finally we saw this very unexpected pawn push, g5, g4. Very difficult to see this. No wonder that Balog played in a more, you can say, conventional fashion in the game. But this was actually very testing for white. It's not clear how they could cope with this. It seems that, for example, the plan of bringing the knight to d5, it wouldn't have the same impact because black already has a lot of counterplay on the queen side. All right. Thanks a lot for joining me on this journey. Hoping to see you soon again. Thanks.